I'm Prudence Carter, and the faculty director at the Research Institute for the Center for Studies in Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. Welcome to our last faculty seminar talk of the academic year. I cannot believe it. We're already here at the end of the 2013-2014 year. And what an amazing way, what I think an amazing series we've had this year. And I'm really, really excited to hear from one of our faculty visiting scholars this year, Carolyn Chen, who will be introduced by our own Professor Gordon Wood. But I just wanted to say hello. Chang, I'm sorry. I made you the historian. Well, you are a historian, but I'm sorry. Go ahead to Chang. That's right. Sorry. I'm so sorry, Cord. Pardon that. That was one of those mental structures. And I don't really even know him. So pardon me. How embarrassing. But I just wanted to say welcome to our talk today. Today's talk is co-sponsored by the Center for East Asian Studies. So I'd like to welcome those of you who are here who are affiliates of the center as well. And please, grab food. We interact and exchange here. Professor Chen will speak after Professor Chang introduces her, and I'll yield the podium to him now. Thank you for coming.
I was wondering if I just got a Pulitzer Prize. I think Gordon Wood got a Pulitzer Prize. Yeah. He's a very, very well-known colonial American historian, and I don't know if you took any classes with him at Brown or anyway. Well, I'm delighted to say a few words about our speaker today, Professor Carolyn Chen from Northwestern University, and who has been with us here at Stanford this past year as visiting scholar with CSRA Rick-Street. And Carolyn Chen is one of the pioneers in the study of religion and ethnicity, and in particular, religion and Asian Americans. Now, pioneer may sound odd to you. Why? Because this topic seems to be so quote unquote natural. How could we not study religion and ethnicity? Well, up until about 10 years ago, we didn't. I mean, we as a field in terms of Asian American studies, for various reasons. Religion and ethnicity, or at least the political agenda or social agenda for Asian American studies, was seen to be somehow incompatible, inconsistent, or an outlier, that religion was not seen to be an important ingredient in Asian American history or contemporary life. Now that seems to be so odd and ignorant as we think back on it, but that's the way it was. And Carolyn was, as I said, one of the pioneers in this field, and worked with every other scholars, historians and sociologists anthropologists who are really breaking all sorts of new ground, both historically as well as in contemporary studies. And I think most of us know, who have any familiarity with Asian American communities today, that religion plays an enormous role in Asian American life. And I think this is what she's been working on this past year. She'll tell us more in a moment. She's not a newcomer to the Bay Area, but studied at UC Berkeley for her graduate work. And so we're lucky to have her back in the Bay Area and maybe see more of her in the future. The title of her work here is up on the board, but I should tell you one last thing before I turn over to her, is that she is completing a fascinating book on Zen and corporate productivity, profitability, something of this sort. Let me get the word correct. The title, Zen and the Art of Corporate Productivity, about the culture of Asian spirituality in Silicon Valley companies, which I think she's been working on this past year. Maybe someone will do Zen and the Art of University Productivity someday. I think I could probably use some instruction on that. So without further ado, Professor Chen.
So So thank you, Gordon, for that very generous introduction, and happy to talk to you about how Zen can make your scholarly work more productive anytime. Well, actually, the talk that I'm giving today is not based on the field work that that I've been doing this year, but I'm happy to talk about that. First, let me thank Jose, David, Salvador, and Prudence Carter and Gordon Chang for making this year possible for me. It's been a very productive year, and it's been really a pleasure to be able to affiliate with the CCSRE. So just a clarification of terms before I begin. When I refer to the second generation, so the first generation refers to immigrants. Second generation refers to the children of immigrants. Now, within the second generation title, I am also including the 1.5 generation. So the 1.5 generation are people who immigrate to the U.S. as children. So they immigrated before the age of 11 and effectively grew up in the U.S. So they're going to be included in the second generation. Okay, so let me begin by introducing you to three people whose religious experiences could be said to typify those of second generation Asian Americans today. Edward Kim is a Korean American evangelical Christian. He's very active in an Asian American evangelical church that is composed of other East Asian American professionals like himself. When I ask Edward about his ethnic identity, he tells me, "I am Christian first." He works over 60 hours a week as an engineer. In his spare time, he plays guitar in the church band, and he plays video games. As I leave, he hands me his business card that reads, "Full-time Christian, part-time engineer." Edward is single. He tells me that he'll marry a woman of any race, quote, "so long as she is Christian." My second typical second-generation Asian American is Aisha Ghazi, whose parents immigrated from Pakistan. So like Edward, Aisha insists that her faith, Islam, is more important to her than her ethnicity. In fact, Aisha wants people to know that she is Muslim. So she wears a hijab, or a headscarf, in accordance with the Muslim teaching that women should cover their heads. She first started doing this in college after she got involved in her university's Muslim Student Association. Her parents were not happy. She says they are just, quote, cultural Muslims. The general pattern, American pattern, is that religiosity and education are inversely related. So that means the more educated you are, the less religious you are. But many Asian Americans are highly educated and very religious, and the religious devotion actually blooms most vividly in the supposed secular bastions of elite universities. For Asian American students, evangelical organizations are the most popular student groups on campus. Asian Americans are more likely to join religious student groups than Christians who are white, Latino, or Black, and they comprise more than 80% of the evangelical fellowships at places like Yale and Stanford. The story is similar with Islam. At selective universities, Muslims have the highest rates of religious observance among all religious groups. Like Aisha, second-generation Muslims often first get serious about their faith when they join a Muslim student organization. But of course, Asian American religions is more than Muslims and evangelicals. So let me introduce you to Sunny Nguyen, a typical example of a second-generation Buddhist. Her parents are refugees from Vietnam. Her mother is devout and has a shrine in the home. Sunny grew up going to the Buddhist temple a few times a year, usually on special occasions like the Lunar New Year. Now that Sunny no longer lives at home, the special occasions are rare indeed. She goes to her grandmother's grave and she lights incense once a year, but she's not sure whether it's a Buddhist thing or a Vietnamese thing. When you ask Sunny about her religious identity, she says hesitatingly, "I'm Buddhist, I guess, because I'm Vietnamese." So Sunny's comments open a window onto the experiences of an important third subgroup in the Asian American religious experience: second-generation mainline Protestants, Catholics, Buddhists, Hindus, and, for lack of a better term, the religiously unaffiliated. Adherents to things like Chinese popular religion, which to outsiders don't look like religion at all. As it turns out, these groups of Asian Americans are much less religious than evangelicals and Muslims. So this slide shows a percentage among the Asian American second generation who claim that religion is very important in their lives. And so you see here that evangelicals and Muslims stand as especially religious compared to the other groups, where over half of their populations consider religion to be very important in their lives. Catholics, mainline Protestants, and Hindus are much less religious, with Buddhists being the less religious group of all. So what explains this richness and variation of Asian American religiosity, both the extraordinary religiosity of the second generation evangelicals and Muslims and the much less fervent behaviors of second generation Catholics, Buddhists, and Hindus? And what do these patterns have to do with the evolving relationship between religion, race, and ethnicity in the US? So Edwards and Aisha's religiosity is not unusual these days, but it is different from the religiosity of earlier waves of immigrant children and from that of whites and other minorities today. That makes Edward and Aisha an anomaly, indeed a puzzle to scholars of American religion whose theories are built on observations of these groups. So scholars offer two different models to understand the connection between religion and race and ethnicity in the US. The first is what I call the theory that religion is America's ethnicity, an idea that began with Alexis de Tocqueville and was most fully articulated by the sociologist Will Herberg in his 1955 classic Protestant Catholic Jew. Religion, this theory holds, is the central organizing mechanism that Americans use to form communities and create distinct identities. Looking at the experiences of European immigrants, Will Herberg predicted that the ethnicity of immigrants' children would decline as they assimilated into American society. Religion would take its place. So instead of identifying as Irish or German or Italian, the second and third generations would assimilate into what he called the triple melting pot of faith and identify as either Catholic, Protestant, and Jew, those being the major American religious groups at Herberg's time. Now, just as Herberg predicted, Asian American evangelicals and Muslims are choosing to identify by religion more than by ethnicity or race. But these assimilated Asian Americans have not joined mainstream congregations. Instead, they worship in racialized spaces where they carve out identities in self-conscious opposition to mainstream America. On the other extreme, groups like Hindus and Buddhists struggle to even maintain their religions that Herberg predicts will become their primary source of identity. The other influential theory in the study of religion, race, and ethnicity comes from the scholarship on African Americans, most famously by E. Franklin Frazier, C. Eric Lincoln, and Lawrence Mamiya. In contrast to Herberg's white ethnic model, where ethnicity declines and religion takes its place, in this model, ethnicity persists because racial minorities are blocked from assimilating into mainstream institutions. Religion then affirms a distinct racial ethnic identity and consciousness. The result is that among racial minorities, a strong ethnic identity correlates with intense religiosity. Indeed, this literature shows that in the 19th and 20th centuries, the social marginalization of slavery and segregation conjured Black religious spaces into being, spaces which became the center of Black religious life in a distinct racial ethnic consciousness. The Black religious experience provides some clues to the puzzle of the pattern of Asian American religiosity. Racial marginalization helps explain why religion plays such a central role in the lives of some of the second generation, particularly Muslims, who have been scrutinized and marginalized even before 9/11. But religion hardly seems to be a source of racial ethnic identity and consciousness to Orthodox Muslims and evangelicals, who insist that their religions transcend ethnicity and race. Furthermore, Black religious experience also leaves us wondering why mainline Protestants, Hindus, and Buddhists, who are racially marginalized as much as their evangelical counterparts, are so lukewarm about their religions. So, in short, theories of race and ethnicity and religion based on white ethnics and African Americans don't fully explain what is happening with the religions of Asian Americans today. People who are assimilated like white ethnics along socioeconomic measures, yet racialized like African Americans, and whose faith traditions often set them apart. So for the first time, we have a nationally representative survey of Asian Americans and their religions, the Pew Center Survey on Asian American Religion, which gives us an opportunity to see the large-scale patterns in Asian American religious behavior. These new findings, along with an outpouring of rich ethnographic and historical studies on various Asian American religious groups, invite us to craft new theoretical and conceptual tools that can synthesize our knowledge of Asian American religions, map their diversity across traditions and generations, and set them in the larger American racial and religious landscape. In this talk, I draw on Herberg and theories of Black religion to sketch the beginnings of a broader and more synthetic theory, one that I hope will can better analyze and explain religiosity among second-generation Asian Americans, and one that can begin a comparative dialogue of race, religion, and ethnicity across different racial groups, generational cohorts, and religious traditions. So let me start by proposing a general theory of race, religion, and assimilation, and then exploring how it applies to the case of second-generation Asian Americans. My argument is that there is a secularizing effect to assimilation. And by assimilation, I mean participation in and acceptance by mainstream social, economic, political, and cultural institutions. So as minorities become assimilated, their religiosity weakens. Conversely, social marginalization often fuels religiosity. Racially marginalized groups tend to be more religious because they depend on religion more for the kinds of belonging that others find through secular mainstream institutions. As E. Franklin Frazier pointed out long ago, the Black church was a quote-unquote total institution for African Americans. It served as a bank, a law firm, a jobs clearinghouse, and more. It offered spaces of autonomy, narratives of dignity, and an alternative system of status in a white world that excluded and dehumanized Black people. This enlarged functional dependence on religion led to a strong identification with and adherence to a distinct Black Christianity. This same pattern applies to other minorities. Religion plays a very instrumental role in the lives of many immigrants. This was certainly true of the Taiwanese immigrants that I studied in my first book. So immigrants, even those who hadn't been religious in Taiwan, they turned to religion in the US to find friends, spouses, jobs, and a sense of self-esteem in a foreign world. And in the process, many became devoutly religious. So survey data consistently shows that minorities who have less access to and less acceptance by the mainstream are always more religious than whites of their same faith tradition. So here you see that Black, Asian, and Latino evangelicals attend religious services more than white evangelicals. And the same is true with Catholics, okay, if you look at different traditions. Now, the religiosity of marginalized groups declines as they become more integrated into mainstream society. Qualitative and quantitative data tell us that the more white, the more assimilated, and the more educated you are, the less likely you are to be religious. So for this data, I turn to the authoritative site on white upper middle class urban culture, Stuff White People Like. So for those of you who don't know, it's a site that pokes fun at white people. Number 2 on this list is religions that their parents don't belong to. They write, white people, quote, white people usually say they are spiritual but not religious, which means that they believe any religion that doesn't involve Jesus. Mostly they are into religion that fits well into their home and their wardrobe and doesn't require them to do too much, end quote. So, they do this in jest, but the authors pick up on a pattern that scholars of earlier European immigration have observed, that as white ethnics became white, their religiosity weakened. And this secularizing effect also applies to other minority groups. So, for example, if we look at Latinos along measures of integration into the United States, along generation, education level, and English usage, we see that the more integrated they become, the less important religion is to them. So if you look along education level, the more educated they are, the less religious, the fewer say that religion is important to them. If you look at generation, you also see that to be the case. And then if you look at language usage, one thing to also point out too is that you really see a big difference between 1 and 2, right? And then between 2 and 3, it kind of stabilizes there. And we can talk a little bit more about that later if you want. So among Catholics who at one time were considered a religious minority, were very much of a religious, quasi-religious and ethnic minority, I'd say, in the US, their weekly religious attendance plummeted to mainstream Protestant levels as they became more accepted by Americans after the 1950s with the passage of anti-discrimination legislation. The dark green line represents Protestants and the light green line represents Catholics, so that you see that into the 2000s that really there's virtually no difference in weekly attendance rates between Catholics and Protestants. So even the black church's influence has declined as blacks have become more integrated into mainstream America. The minister and Princeton professor of African American religion, Eddie Glaude, has gone so far as to announce that the black church is dead. So does this secularizing effect of assimilation also apply to Asian Americans? And if it does, the second generation, which is more assimilated, will be less religious than the first. So I'm going to measure secularization from first to second generation by looking at two dimensions. The first is levels of religious salience, and the second is rates of religious affiliation. In other words, I'm asking how many of the second generations stay in the faith that they grew up in? And of those who stay, how religious are they relative to their parents? So a decline either in religious affiliation or in religious salience indicates secularization, okay? So this slide gives you a portrait of religious affiliation among the second generation. And can you read this? Can you read that? Or is it too dark? This says no religion, okay? And this says Catholic, this is 20%, and no religion is 32%. Can you read the rest, or do you need me to?
How much is Buddhist?
Buddhist is, sorry, 11%, okay? So if you look at this, among those who religiously affiliate, the majority is Christian. But another thing that really stands out is the size of the religiously unaffiliated, right, at 32%. That number among Americans is, it's increasing every day, but I believe it's at about 20% now. And it's always, since the 50s to the 90s, has always been about 5 to 7%. So it's increased dramatically. But part of the reason for this large no religious affiliation is that Asian Americans, the first generation immigrants, there's a large proportion of Asian immigrants who claim no religious affiliation, particularly Chinese Americans. About half of Chinese Americans claim no religious affiliation, but that itself is really problematic. I mean that categorization, because many Chinese Americans do have spiritual or religious practices, but which simply have no formal name or are not formally categorized as religion. So these American surveys that try to capture the religions of Asian Americans are not. They're not very precise. So the no religion category is a huge proportion of the population, and they're really understudied and not really well understood. Okay. This slide shows the percentage of Asian Americans who claim that religion is important, very important in their lives by generation. So I see the colors have been changed. I don't know what happened here, but on my screen, they show up as blue and red, but here they show up as purple and black. Okay, so the purple column represents the first generation, and the black column represents the second generation. So you see here, so the general pattern for most groups is decline, right? So secularization in the second generation. But you do see an exception among the evangelicals, where the second generation actually claims that religion is more important in their lives than the first generation. We'll see a little later that this attitude, that there's some differences between attitude and behavior, but we could just say they stay fairly stable. The other group, which stays fairly stable, but there's a slight decline, is Muslims, and then also Hindus as well. But for all the other groups, there are quite dramatic declines, I'd say, especially among the Catholics and the Buddhists, in terms of the levels of religious salience from first to second generation. Now, assimilation doesn't make Asian Americans into atheists. It cools their religiosity so that it looks more like their white brethren in faith. So this is really only possible to measure among the Christian groups. This slide compares rates of weekly church attendance. So this is behavior, which is most sociologists would consider a better measure of religiosity, but because we couldn't compare religious behavior across all the different religious traditions, I had to go with religious salience. But if we just look at religious behavior, weekly church attendance among Asian American and white Christians. So you see here that oh gosh, these colors are all mixed up. So here, this represents the white weekly church attendance among these different groups. Among evangelical mainline Protestants and Catholics. And what's interesting here is that you see that both mainline Protestants and Catholics, that there's a dramatic decrease from the first to second generation, and then a slight decrease even in the third generation. And so they start to, by the second generation, they're approximating white levels of religious behavior, but you don't see that among evangelicals. There is a decline. Right, there is a decline in religious behavior, in weekly church attendance among evangelicals, but it's much more stable. Okay, so another window into understanding how religiosity changes in the second generation is to look at rates of religious affiliation from the first to second generation. So. This slide shows rates of religious retention among the second generation. So the first column represents those who stayed. The second generation, the second line represents, so the black line represents those who converted to another religion, and then the yellow line represents those who left for no religion. And because of the way Pew structured its survey questions, we could not tell whether evangelicals grew up as evangelicals, so they're just collapsed within the Protestant category here, and they're just lumped together. So the patterns of religious affiliation are somewhat similar to the patterns of religious salience, where Muslims are at one end of the spectrum, and then you have Catholics and Protestants, and then Hindus and Buddhists are at the far end of the spectrum, right? So where you see that Muslims are retaining the faith at the highest level. Then you have Protestant Catholics, and then Hindus, and then Buddhists. Less than half are actually retaining their faith. Now, this slide gives a summary of all the differences of just the past slides that you see. So in the first column here, you see that represents the constancy in religious salience from first to second generation. How much does the second generation actually, what's the difference in the change of religious salience? The second is level of religious retention. And then the third column is, these numbers tell you how shifts in religious affiliation affect the share of each religion to the total population. So what you see here is that Muslims have very high rates of religious retention at slightly lower levels of religious salience than their parents, with few converts into the faith. Evangelicals have moderate rates of religious retention at the same levels of religious salience as their parents, with a sizable number of converts. Mainline Protestants have a moderate rates of religious retention at lower levels of religious salience, with a sizable number of converts. Catholics have moderate rates of religious retention at much lower levels of religious salience than their parents, with few converts. Hindus, low rates of religious retention at about the same levels of religious salience as their parents, with no converts. And Buddhists have very low rates of religious retention, much lower rates of religious salience than their parents, and few converts. Okay. So the things to notice here is that Hindu, Buddhism, and Catholicism are losing numbers. So those are the numbers with in this row here, with the negative percentage. Muslims are staying about the same in number. Few people are leaving the faith, but few people are converting. And Protestants are gaining some members. People are leaving, but more people are actually converting into the faith. The really interesting category here is is the religiously no affiliation, and the biggest increases in that number where they're gaining 50%. And that has a lot to do with the fact that the second generation Asian American are part of the American demographic that's most likely to be religiously unaffiliated. They're younger than the general population, American population, they're highly educated, they're urban, and they're concentrated in the West and the Northeast. That kind of is a demographic profile of a religiously unaffiliated person. And so they're basically, Asian Americans are assimilating into their larger sort of religious environment. So the secularizing effect of assimilation applies to the second generation, either because they're dropping out of the faith or because those who stay religious are less religious than their parents. But two groups stand out as particularly religious and who have better been able to resist the secularizing effect of assimilation and whose levels of religiosity are higher than the rest, Muslims and evangelical Christians. So why is this the case and why should we care? Let me try to get at this question by first discussing the specific context that second-generation Asian American religious experience takes place, what I call the crisis of authenticity. Unlike their immigrant parents, most second-generation Americans face virtually no barriers to the mainstream. By most demographic measures, the second generation are even whiter than the white. As they are even whiter than whites, as they exceed most whites on social demographic measures like education and income. In fact, sometimes I like to jokingly refer to them as the other white meat from the ad campaign for pork in the 1980s, of course, with emphasis on the other. Most of the second generation live, work, and socialize, and many intermarry with whites. They experience far less economic, cultural, residential, and social marginalization and segregation than their immigrant parents and other minority groups. So the problem the second generation faces is not access to mainstream society, but rather acceptance as real Americans because of their race. They are eternal foreigners who are still asked, "Where are you from?" no matter how long they've been in the United States. But they also don't feel like authentic Asians. Nazli Kubria shows that second generations may maintain their ethnic identities as, say, Chinese Americans or Indian Americans, but they've lost a fluency in their own ethnic traditions as they've integrated into the mainstream. Only 18% of the second generation report speaking their parents' language very well. This is really different from second generation Latinos, which I don't know the number, but I think it's well over 50%. Many claim that they, do you know the exact number? It's over 70. It's over 70s.
Even in the fourth generation,
Right.
it's still about 60.
Right. So Latinos. So if you compare Latinos with Asian Americans have lost their fluency in their native, their ethnic language. Many claim that they do not know the meaning behind Asian cultural traditions, and as a result, no longer practice them. They feel insecure about their ethnic authenticity. They don't feel Asian enough. Nor does the racial category of Asian Americans seem to offer a meaningful source of identity for most Asian Americans. Perhaps because it lumps dozens of ethnicities into one group, the category feels forced and arbitrary to many of the second generation. So indeed, among the second generation, only 23% identify themselves first and foremost as Asian American. The largely educated and middle-class second generation has full access to the mainstream, but they still lack full acceptance by the mainstream. And this failure to be fully accepted as not only authentically American, but authentically Asian, and Asian American is what I call the Asian American crisis of authenticity. And it is this lack of acceptance and authenticity that drives the religiosity of people like Edward Kim and Aisha Ghazi, who I introduced at the beginning of this talk. Throughout American history, marginalized peoples have used their religions to form new boundaries of identity and community that transcend the limits of their social location and to define themselves on their own terms. Religion's promise of dignity, autonomy, and authenticity has attracted many kinds of minorities, from the early pilgrims to African slaves to these upwardly mobile second-generation Asian Americans that I'm talking about today. Religion's inclusive promise has made it an effective vehicle for marginalized peoples to create new and separate worlds in order to be saved from this one. It's this creative tension between the promise of religion and the reality of minorities' racial location, I argue, that animates this religiosity of the second generation. But not all religions are equally capable of creating these communities of belonging and igniting the same levels of religious commitment among their members. Second generation evangelical Christians and Muslims, I argue, have a religious advantage over other religious traditions because they set themselves apart in three ways. First, they have strong boundaries that differentiate them from mainstream secular society. Second, they decouple religion and ethnicity. And third, they consecrate their racial difference. Let me discuss the first factor that distinguishes second generation Islam and evangelical Christianity from other religious traditions. They have strong boundaries that differentiate them from secular mainstream society. So scholars argue that religions that have strong oppositional boundaries against this mainstream command high religious commitment and identity from their members because they deem mainstream alternatives to be immoral and evil. The boundaries produced by oppositional religions create an effect similar to that produced by social marginalization. Both restrict members from full participation and belonging in mainstream society, and this seems to fuel religiosity. The key difference is that oppositional religions set up voluntary boundaries against the mainstream. However, racial minorities face involuntary barriers to the mainstream. So take the case of Protestant Christianity. Different traditions within Protestant Christianity exhibit varying levels of opposition with the world. Evangelicals practice a high opposition religion. 81% of them believe that it is very important for Christians to live a life radically different from mainstream America, something that only 59% of mainline Protestants believe. In this slide, we see that the levels of opposition correspond to weekly church attendance rates among the different groups. So across all races, you see that high opposition evangelicals, who are in purple, attend church weekly at much higher rates than their lower opposition mainline Protestants, who are in black. Okay. So high opposition religions command higher levels of religiosity among their members than low opposition religions because they form strong boundaries that set themselves apart and against from secular society. So we witness this opposition in Asian American evangelicals in their common declaration, "I am Christian first," which is what Edward Kim said at the beginning of this talk. In a world where they are neither real Americans nor real Asians, it is very reassuring that they can be real Christians. Asian evangelicals feel like an embattled minority in an American society where materialism, loose sexual morals, and excessive individualism run rampant. They draw strong lines of boundaries between themselves and non-Christians and regard one of their primary missions to bring the unsaved into their fold. Evangelicals have produced an impressive bulwark of evangelical institutions and consumer products, schools, music, books, to protect them from the secular influence of the world. This sense of tension and opposition shapes how evangelicals interact with the world. They are supposed to, quote, be in, but not of the world. Being Christian first is not just an option for evangelicals, but it's a religious command that is all the more potent for those who feel marginalized because of their race. Second generation Muslims also have an oppositional orientation to the mainstream, one that is even more powerfully shaped by the oppression and stigmatization that they experience in the US. In the wake of 9/11, wars, and international tension between the US and Middle East, Muslims are not merely outsiders, but they're considered anti-American and enemies of the country. Islam is what Edward Said calls America's, quote, post-Soviet devil. So much of what it means to be Muslim in the US today is the experience of being an oppressed, racialized, religious minority. No matter their religious affiliation, South Asian and Arab-looking peoples are racialized as Muslim and have been attacked for looking like terrorists. This anti-Muslim hostility has profoundly influenced the vitality of Islam. Importantly, the second generation experience anti-Muslim hostility more acutely than their foreign-born parents, according to the Pew Study on Muslims. And it has led many second-generation Muslims to disidentify with being an American. an identity that now seems impossible, and to seize an identity as Muslim. Quote, I think September 11 made me feel forced to choose between identities. Sociologist Lori P. quotes one woman as saying, she says, at first people weren't going to accept us. I was like, if they're not going to accept me as an American, then I'm going to have to choose Islam. No one's ever going to tell me, you can't be Muslim, you're not a Muslim. If I have to choose, I choose to be Muslim. End quote. Social marginalization has pulled second-generation Muslims toward an orthodox interpretation of faith that draws distinct boundaries between them and the secular mainstream that they consider to be hedonistic and idolatrous. The Muslim second generation are often preoccupied with the question of how to be Muslim in a secular world, and they wonder how much contact they should have with non-Muslims. They do not participate in typical activities of their young peers like dancing, drinking, or dating. And like evangelicals, Muslims have created their own alternatives to secular youth culture, like Islamic hip-hop and Islamic stand-up comedy. Catholicism, Hinduism, and Buddhism also have their oppositional orientations that are even more radical than the practices of these evangelicals and Muslims. So think monasteries and ashrams. But their second generation doesn't embrace them. Part of the reason is the very radicalism of these orientations. The three faiths have a special category of people that Max Weber calls religious elites, monks and sadhus, people who are on the fast track to enlightenment or salvation. Importantly, monastics live apart from us and differently from us, and they engage in ascetic renunciations that are radically oppositional, like taking vows of celibacy and shunning participation in the secular economy. In these traditions, at least how they've been practiced by Asians, it's different by white Buddhists, I'd say, the laity often depend on the pious services of the religious elites. And the laity aren't expected to renounce the world in the same way that members of Orthodox traditions of Protestantism and Islam are. The monastic tradition makes it easier for Hindus, Catholics, and Buddhists to stay in a non-oppositional stance toward the world. Now, let me turn to the second factor that distinguishes evangelical Christians and Muslims from the rest. They decouple religion from their inherited Asian ethnicity. Asian evangelicals have an oppositional stance against not only mainstream American society, but also their ethnic culture and values of their parents. When they say they are Christian first, they mean they are Christian first before Asian. Although most grew up in Christian homes and attended immigrant churches, they do not see their religion as part of their ethnic tradition. In fact, many adopt an evangelical Christianity that is deliberately and aggressively not Asian. Second-generation evangelicals embrace what they perceive to be a pure and authentic Christianity against the materialistic, quote, materialistic, culturally tainted, and status-driven Christianity of their immigrant parents. Influenced by the therapeutic culture of American evangelicalism, the second generation is critical of an Asian American culture, of an Asian culture that they feel is psychologically and spiritually damaging. Sharon Kim writes how one pastor rather dramatically refers to second-generation church members as, quote, the walking wounded generation, victims of an emotionless Asian culture that fails to offer unconditional parental affirmation. So think Tiger Mom. The titles of popular Asian American books like Following Jesus Without Dishonoring Your Parents point to the deep tension evangelicals feel towards their parents' culture. Indeed, the ability to make lifestyle choices against the values of both Asian and mainstream culture is often a point of pride and a sign of piety among evangelicals. Now, Muslims are no less critical of their ethnic culture. More orthodox than their parents, they aspire to what they see as a culturally pure and intellectual Islam that they wish to differentiate from the, quote, culturally tainted Islam of their parents. As one man said of his immigrant parents' Islam, quote, so much of what passes for Islam in Bangladesh is superstition, end quote. Perhaps the most visible symbol of this orthodox orientation is the growing popularity of wearing the hijab or the headscarf. Many have made the deliberate choice to wear hijab in early adulthood based on their socialization into a second-generation Muslim American subculture, such as the Muslim Students Association. Many of these women's mothers actually do not wear the hijab, and they are putting it on over their parents' objections. So, like evangelicals, Muslims are choosing religiously defined lifestyles directly in opposition to the cultures of their ethnic group and mainstream society. Second-generation Catholics, Hindus, and Buddhists are very different. They see their religion as inextricably bound with their ethnic cultures. Filipino Catholics don't say, "I'm Catholic first." Instead, members from these groups say things like, "Being Filipino means being Catholic," or "I'm Hindu because I'm Indian." In one sense, the coupling of religion and ethnicity makes ethnicity more tenacious because it becomes embedded in religious institutions and practices, as scholar Pyongyat Min argues. So American Jews are a good example of this. But I'd argue that the coupling of religion and ethnicity comes at a religious cost, particularly among groups who are upwardly mobile and who face few barriers to mainstream assimilation. As the second generation integrate and lose their fluency with their ethnic culture, they also lose their religion. This is most evident among second-generation Hindus and Buddhists who have both low levels of religious retention and religiosity. Many Hindus and Buddhists claim that they don't understand their faith traditions. Religion is something that they do only when they are at home with their parents, and some have come to regard these practices as, quote, silly and superstitious. So unlike their parents, who are immigrants, or ethnic minorities, who live in segregated enclaves, they don't face barriers to the mainstream that force them to stay ethnic and to stay religious. And their low opposition religions do not require them to be observant. So in comparison, religions like Islam and evangelical Christianity are more portable and resilient as immigrant generations move from the margins to the mainstream because they are decoupled from an ethnic culture that is fading. Finally, the third way that evangelical Christianity and Islam are different from the other religions is that they embrace and consecrate new racialized boundaries. By consecrate, I mean that evangelical Christianity and Islam redefine the racialized categories that society imposes on them and their members into religious terms and transform what are otherwise arbitrary and stigmatized categories into meaningful and voluntary, indeed authentic categories. Evangelical Christianity is arguably the most popular source of association and identity among second-generation East Asian Americans. It is an antidote to the Asian American crisis of authenticity. It offers new and authentic contours for belonging and identity that are neither ascribed nor inherited, like race or ethnicity. Yet, paradoxically, even though Christianity claims to transcend racial and ethnic boundaries, Asian American evangelicals tend to worship apart in their own churches that are primarily composed of East Asian professionals who attended top colleges, grew up in immigrant churches, but now feel distant from them, and they don't quite feel comfortable in white churches. There is a religious reason to self-segregate, Asian American evangelicals claim. Here, in their own Asian American congregations and organizations, they can best proselytize and minister to the special spiritual needs of other Asian Americans. Thus, evangelicals consecrate the imposed racial category of Asian Americans, even as they define themselves by their shared spiritual rather than racial struggles. Evangelicals can be most faithful to the call to, quote, spread the gospel by reaching out and organizing along racial lines. Orthodox Islam has become the basis of a new and vibrant multi-ethnic second-generation Muslim American community and identity. This embrace of universalism, ironically, is fueled by Islamophobia and the racialization of Islam that pits brown people of all ethnicities together because they look Muslim. The second generation is certainly critical of the stereotypes and ethnic lumping, but they've also used this unfortunate situation to redefine what it means to be Muslim and to create solidarity across all ethnicities. Although the religious practices of Middle Eastern Muslims are quite different from those of South Asian Muslims, they share the same experience of being an oppressed and racialized religious minority in the US. The second generation is moving beyond the ethnic particularism of their immigrant parents and ethnic-specific mosques to realize the Prophet Muhammad's vision of the Ummah, the universal community of Muslims. Quote, "That's what Islam in America is all about," reflects writer Asma Gul Hassan, a second-generation Pakistani American. Quote, "Muslims from all over the world coming together and thereby losing their emphasis on their native cultures and working together to find an understanding of Islam that we all agree on." One woman remarks, quote, "If your brother or sister is not Muslim, but a stranger is, you're closer to that stranger than your own brother or sister." End quote. So the racialization of Islam may be forcing Muslims to expand boundaries of who they consider to be their brother and sister to include all brown people and beyond. But the second generation reinterpret this as an opportunity to finally realize the universal community of Islam in the US in a way that their immigrant parents and their ancestors in Asia never have. As one second generation Muslim put it, here you become a better Muslim. In comparison to evangelicals and Muslims, the other religious groups have really struggled to make the second generation's reality of racial experience religiously meaningful. They are behind the racial times, so to speak. For the most part, these religions have resisted organizing along racial lines among the native-born. The Catholic Church provides Vietnamese and Tagalog masses for the first generation Vietnamese and Filipinos, but it doesn't provide a separate Asian American mass for the second generation. It's not a surprise then that 14% of second generation Catholics leave the faith for evangelical Christianity because they can worship with other native-born Asian Americans. The Hindu and Buddhist second generation don't have religious options that they find satisfactory either. Although they are comfortable in their parents' congregations, they don't quite belong, and they do not understand the rituals, and they may not understand the language. But they find white religious alternatives even more alienating. For example, the meditation-heavy Buddhism that most whites practice is so different from the devotional Buddhism of most Asian immigrants that it might as well be another religion altogether. And then there's also the discomfort of being a minority in a largely white space. The result is that Buddhism has drastically declined among the second generation. Hindus are slightly different. The Hindu second generation is far less observant than Muslims and evangelicals, but more observant than the Buddhists. Almost half of second generation Hindus leave the faith, but those who stay maintain the religiosity of their parents. This variation can be explained the rise of what sociologist Prema Kurian calls, quote, official Hinduism, and organizations like the World Hindu Council that propound a more oppositional form of Hinduism whose origins are rooted in Hindu nationalism. But still, these Hindu groups are nowhere near as popular among the second generation as Islam and evangelical Christianity, or even the groups organized around the pan-ethnic banner of South Asia. So let me quickly conclude here. I started this talk with two questions. Why do we witness such stark variations in the religiosity of second generation Asian Americans among different religious groups? And what do these patterns have to do with the evolving, what do these do with race, ethnicity, and religion in the US? I've argued that religion among Asian Americans need to be theorized on their own terms because they have distinct class, racial, and religious experiences that do not conform to those of either white ethnics or blacks. Building on the theories of Herberg and Black religious experience, I've offered a theory that looks at how two forms of boundary making, the involuntary racial barriers due to social marginalization and voluntary religious boundaries, interact to shape religiosity among second-generation Asian Americans. Assimilation has a secularizing effect, I argue, but religious groups that have strong oppositional boundaries against the mainstream resist the tide of secularization. Second-generation Asian Americans, an upwardly mobile but not quite accepted group, are especially attracted to these religions, and they use Islam and evangelical Christianity to carve authentic spaces of belonging and identity on their own terms, against both the ethnicity inherited by their parents and the imposed racial identities of mainstream America. But religion cannot completely escape the limits of race. The evangelical case illustrates the contradictory way that religions can claim racial transcendence, but then voluntarily reaffirm racialized boundaries. The Muslim case shows that a faith with universal claims and genuinely multiracial congregations can still be racialized as a brown religion. But to conclude that race simply trumps the universal and transcendent vision of religion for Asian Americans is to miss another important point. Religion does create new boundaries of peoplehood and belonging. Evangelical Christianity arguably has been the most effective grassroots source of Asian American pan-ethnicity, gathering disparate East Asian Americans as one. Similarly, Islam has successfully unified people from various racial and ethnic groups under a new identity as Muslim America. Where categories of ethnicity and race have failed to meet Asian American needs for identity and belonging, religion has powerfully fulfilled that role. Evangelical Christianity and Islam have attracted their devotion because they resolve the Asian American crisis of authenticity. Okay, thank you.